The greatest thing in Michigan is to be a child of God.
Amen.
Now, some of you you're too sleepy. Let me try that again. The greatest thing in Michigan is to be a child of God. That's better. You know, every Sunday morning, one of the things that we are all reminded of, probably more so than any other day of the week, is that we're children of God. We've come together. We've come to worship our God and to remember that we're His children, that we're followers of Jesus Christ, and to remember the cost that was involved in you and I becoming children of God. It's a special day. I know every day is special, and every day we're Christians, but Sunday seems to be a very special day. I want to put just a little tidbit in there about the men's wild game night last night. I know at the Feltners, some of the ladies gathered and had a good time, probably not as much as we did. And whoever made the apple cider mousse stew, it was outstanding. It really was. And of course, I had to have some wild cow. And potatoes and carrots and, you know, and I went up to get a dessert, and somebody had done something horrible. They had cut a piece of carrot cake in half, making the whole pan unbalanced. So I solved that one. That half and the next piece, that health food went to me. It was really a great time. We had a lot of visitors, and we were glad that they came and spent the time with us, and it was just a really good time of fellowship. And we thank all the men who were involved in setting up and cooking and serving and cleaning up. I mean, there were so many people involved in doing that. That's too many to name, but we just thank all of you for doing that. I want you to open your Bibles, if you still have it there near you, to Mark chapter 16. Kerry came up to me last night, and he kind of whispered to me. He says, "I'm not feeling real good. Can you be on standby?" I said, "Well, sure," thinking that he was going to get better after he had a night's rest. 6 o'clock this morning, I got a text saying, "Stand by, you're it." And so we're praying that he gets better and feels better because of the extra rest maybe he's getting this morning. And we miss him when he's here, and I'm always thankful for the opportunity of filling in. We've been studying, cruising Mark on Sunday morning, and in our cruise, we would make several stops and look at different places in the book of Mark, and we were coming to the end of it, and so on such a short notice to share with you, we're cruising Mark, and we're stopping at Mark chapter 16. The best news that this old weary, dreary, teary world has ever heard is when those weeping women went to the grave of Jesus, worried, by the way, how in the world are we going to move that stone? I mean, we're just women, and that stone is too large, and there's just no way we're going to be able to do that. And all of a sudden, when they show up, the stone was already moved, and the grave was empty, and Jesus was risen. What a moment. It's kind of interesting. When we go to a Bible class, most of us, or we hear a sermon, we say, you know what? I've heard that 100 times. Yeah, but you probably need to be reminded one more to bring back to your memory and make it fresh in your mind that this really, really happened. When I was a young boy, my cousins and I would go, and we were able to get into the local swimming pool early because my step-grandfather, Mike, was working for Parks and Recreation, and so part of his job was the mechanical part of all the swimming pools in town. So we got there early. Nobody else is there but me and my cousins. So we come up with a game. We would throw a handful of pennies in the deep end of the pool and let them settle down. Then jump in and go down to the bottom and see how many you could gather up and bring back up. Well, you would dive in, you would go to the bottom. As you went down and down and down till you hit it, and you start gathering up pennies and stuff, and you try to get one more and one more and one more, and finally you just are running out of air, and you push off the bottom of the pool, come swimming out of the top and gasping for air. Now, the only reason I tell you that story is multiply that 1,000,000 times. And think of Jesus coming out of the tomb after being wrapped up, thought to be totally dead, and he is risen. It's a God thing. It absolutely is a God thing right here. Matter of fact, Peter, in his great sermon on the day of Pentecost, he put it like this: you nailed him to a cross, and you put him to death, but God raised him up, putting an end to the agony of death, because it was not possible for him to be held in death's power. Not possible. Now, why is that such good news? Why is that something that we remember? Why is that something that we celebrate every day of our walk with Christ? I mean, how can something that happened over 2,000 years ago to somebody else have anything to do with you and me? Well, it has everything to do with us because of who it is that died and why it is that he died and what happened to him after he died. If you look at the empty tomb and you study it in scriptures and you look at it in light of the claims that Jesus made, and you study the gospel records, and you see that Jesus of Nazareth, little old tiny town, by the way, been there, seen that, done that, didn't buy the t-shirt. Really, really a small place. Some shepherds around, a few people who live there. Jesus of Nazareth, he claimed to be God in human form. Wow. You say, well, Tom, what do you mean? He said, the Father and I are one, and he who has seen me has seen the Father. You can read it. If you want to go over to John chapter 14 and start reading there, he took upon himself the prerogatives of God right here. He claimed to have the power to forgive sin. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 2, he said that one day he was going to come back to the earth with his holy angels and in the glory of the Father and be the judge of every man, woman, boy, and girl who has ever lived on planet earth, according to Matthew chapter 25. John chapter 5 and in verse 22, he says, the Father judges no one, but has given all the judgment to his Son. Now, with claims like this, if you were the average person of that day, you would draw the conclusion that you either believe what he's saying or he's a lunatic. He's a nutcase. I mean, who in the world? You know, he's a liar. I mean, he's deranged. And they would all say that, except for one thing. God raised him from the dead. Then it makes you start thinking, well, who is he anyway? I mean, what are we to assume right here? In Romans chapter 1, verse 4, Paul said Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. When Jesus burst forth from the grave, is the God who made you and the God before whose throne one day we will all stand to be judged, the resurrection of Jesus has to become good news. It's got to be so. If anything in life excites you, it should be the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If that doesn't get your juices going, I'm sorry. You just can't read about it. You can't think about it very long without realizing, look at the conflict that Jesus was going through. Let me take you all the way back to where you know. In the Garden of Eden, everybody who knows the Garden of Eden, raise your hand. Okay, you know in the Bible that there's a Garden of Eden, and in that Garden of Eden, God judged Satan. And Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 talks about that Satan one day would hurt him, talking about his son Jesus, but, he would crush Satan. But how was that going to happen? If Satan is a defeated foe, how's that going to come about? And 1 John 3:8 says, the Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. And Paul said that when he nailed our sin debt to the cross in Colossians 2:14, he disarmed the rulers and the authorities, the demonic powers, okay, and triumphed over them. See, on the cross, Jesus battled death, and he won. On that cross, he disarmed the rulers and the authorities, and Jesus met evil on the cross, and he won. And when good met evil, and good won for us, that's why we get together. Makes all the difference in the world. Those of us who are followers of Christ are followers of him because we know this. Some of us were blessed growing up with wonderful Bible school teachers who taught us every Sunday and every Wednesday, and we were in those Bible classes, and we learned and we learned and we learned, and we learned about Jesus, and we learned about the Bible, and we learned about the Word of God. And as we were learning about it, eventually we came to the point where we were asking ourselves, Jesus is really something special. He is the Son of God, and he died for me. And our faith grew, and our faith grew, and our faith grew. And when we started to understand the resurrection and the implication of it, and the reality of death that occurred there at the cross. I mean, to have a real resurrection, you got to have a real death, don't you? And the Lord, his Spirit went out to the Father's care, and from there he went out and preached to the folks who lived in Noah's day, according to 1 Peter 3 and verse 18. And this beautiful, powerful, physical body went limp and lifeless. Quickly, everybody said it was another victim of the jaws of death. He died. Pilate got word of it. His soldiers who were assigned to do the job, they knew about it. Jewish leaders and other Jewish people knew about it. And so everybody knew that Jesus was dead. He died on that Roman cross. And throughout history, there has been all kinds of attempts to prove that he did not really die. And yet everybody knows he died. The representatives of the Roman Empire executed him. They sealed the gravestone and they set guards over it. And when I was doing some study for the Life of Christ class that we have on Tuesday, I ran across a historian by the name of Adolf Harnack, and he's a noted historian who does not believe in the resurrection. So out of curiosity, I want to read a little bit about what he has to say about the crucifixion of Christ. And it's so interesting when you read his notes and stuff, he is amazed. He is amazed that the followers of Jesus had such confidence because it was rooted in the fact that they believed that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, that he was risen. And because of that fact of his death, that became the main article of their preaching and teaching about him. That Jesus' body was dead. That the death of Jesus is an indisputable fact of Jewish and Roman history, no one doubts. But he said this. He said, the 11 disciples who went out into the world ready to die themselves. This man says, men don't die for a lie. Do you understand with me the influence the death of Christ has? If you were in Mark chapter 15, if you back up beginning at verse 42 right there, it's the glory of the resurrection. And we don't want to forget the glory of Jesus' death, but he died like he lived. He died well. And as you and I read and study about it, it's his death. It's the way he faced it that causes the thief on one side to ask for mercy. He sees a man dying well, and he's having a horrible time with it. Now, of course, they were mocking him and making fun of him, and the soldiers who were standing around there seeing everything, hearing everything, because they're the ones who are executing Jesus. One of them, it's so interesting, they called him the Son of God. Because I've seen a lot of men die and none like this one. No one. He must be the Son of God. Joseph and Nicodemus, they go up to Pilate. They ask for the body. And with the absence of any kind of whining right here, they're offering mercy to his murderers. And the thought toward his mother, he's saying, care for her. John, take care of my mother. He's an example on that cross for you and I on how to live and how to die. You just don't get very many examples on how to die, do you? It's enough for you and me that we die well. Remember Stephen when he prayed for those who were stoning him to death in Acts 9? There's no doubt that he drew some strength from his knowledge of Jesus Christ and through prayer. And if we follow Jesus' example in dying, we can have a source of strength for other people around us as well as ourselves. I like in Fox's Book of Martyrs, it gives an example of an old man and a young man being burned for their faith. And in that, as the torches were being brought up to burn the old man and the young man began to weep and he's drawing up, back away, and the old man cried out to him, "Courage, my friend, these flames will heal us both and lift us to heaven." How do you say things like that in times like that? But the death is incomplete according to chapter 15 and verse 46. It's a good thing if we learn to die well, but it's not enough for Jesus. You see, we need to know that if death has the last word, and if evil has the last word, listen to the last sentence in Jesus' life. When they were talking about his death, they said they took him down, they wrapped him in linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb and rolled the stone over the door. Now, you and I understand the reality of death. We've been to enough funerals. We've been to enough graveyards. We know the finality of when they're lowered in the ground. The stone has been placed, giving their name, their birth date, their death date, whatever else is carved in, and they piled the dirt on. That's the reality of death. And sometimes it takes a funeral for us to remember that, or a supper that makes us stop and remember. But thank God that's not the end of it. Because we have, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. You and I know what happened when those who were gathered around walked away when the stone was put in place. And you know, the sadness of it all and stuff. But there's victory over sorrow here, because the terrible events on Friday began with the arrest in the garden, and they continued all the way through all those mocking trials and climaxing at the brutal crucifixion. And it struck fear in the hearts of those who knew Jesus. And yet, John tells us the only one who didn't run tells us that they went to the house, they locked the door for fear of the Jews. Were they going to be next? But Jesus wasn't alone when he died. John was there. A lot of the faithful women were there. Among them was Jesus' mother Mary, his own mother Salome, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Mary Magdalene, from whom Luke tells us that Jesus had cast out 7 devils in Luke chapter 8 and verse 2. These and some other godly women like Joanna were there, and the wife of Herod's steward was there. Susanna and others who were involved in the financial backing of Jesus' ministry and the work that the disciples were doing and stuff. And here they were all here. It's almost like a pre-picture of what the church is going to be like. That they're here to support, to encourage, to help one another from every level of society, from those who had and those who had not. I mean, all of them here. Somebody from, Old Testament saints and Herod's palace and demon-possessed people who had them cast out. They were there, and they were all joined together because of one thing. They had a love for Jesus. And that's what got us up this morning. We're here because we have a love for Jesus. The question now is, what's going to happen to the body? Time is running out. Jesus died at 3 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock, the Jews wouldn't carry his body because that'd be a violation, of the Sabbath. It's really kind of interesting there. The soldiers, if you left it up to them, they're going to take the body and carry it outside of town and throw it on a dump heap. But God wouldn't allow that. A man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea, who the Bible describes as a high-ranking official in the Jewish Senate, the Sanhedrin. He's an Old Testament saint. He's good. He's righteous. He's just like Jesus' parents. He's one who's looking out for the kingdom of God. And he had not voted to kill Jesus like so many of the others. And he steps forward. And John tells us that he was really a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he was afraid of what the others would think. And when he stood up, Nicodemus apparently stood up too, who also served on the Sanhedrin and who had talked one night with Jesus back in John chapter 3. And he stood up too, and they boldly went to Pilate, and they asked for the Lord's body. And Pilate granted their wish. So they lovingly took down the Lord's body, wrapped him in that grave clothes, and put some sweet-smelling spices of myrrh and aloes on him. And they left the body buried in Joseph's family tomb in Jerusalem. It was a cave in the rock. And as you and I know, covered by a stone, a heavy stone. And seeing or hearing about this, I'm sure with gratitude, was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph. The death of Jesus reversed some roles here, didn't it? Men and women who lived one way now are acting different. Another way. I mean, it brought two secret disciples kind of up to the forefront, and what was that going to cost them? Do you think the other Sanhedrin members didn't know who was involved in taking care of the body of Jesus? Oh, they knew quickly, I'm sure, as word passed around. And what else was going to happen here? Pilate, who's kind of a fickle guy anyway, when you read about him, he could say, well, wait a minute, those two guys, I'll just sentence them for treason. And we'll just kill them too. All of this going on. And if there's anything that this weary, teary, dreary world needs, it's for Christians to come forth out of hiding and display their colors. Display who they are. Live like who they are. Not afraid of what others think or what others will say. You see, there needs to be a victory over our stumbling blocks that chapter 16 so clearly tells us right here. He ends his gospel record with the Sunday morning announcement that came from a young angel, apparently. And notice the women with their spices were worried about the stone, and it was beyond their strength to move it. But when God asked you and me to do something, isn't it amazing how he enables things for us so we can do it? He turns stumbling stones into stepping stones so that you and I can step out and be the Christian men and women that he desires us to be. There's so many records in the Bible to help us understand that. David and Goliath. I mean, here's David, little old David with a sling and a few stones. And God provides. That's enough. That'll do the job. Because with God behind it, every giant falls. No stone between you and doing God's will is too big for God. It looks too big for us, but it's not too big for him. The angel had moved the stone, and he moves another one when he says to them, he is risen. Go and tell the disciples and Peter. Go and tell the disciples and Peter. Go and tell those disciples and Peter. How would you have felt if you was Peter? Wow. And if Mark's gospel is really, Peter's preaching, and I believe most of it is, Peter never got over the fact that in spite of his failure, that the Lord didn't give up on him. You and I would have. I'm sorry, if we were the disciples and the way Peter behaved and the way he acted, we would have despised him. We wouldn't have forgave him. How dare could you have said what you said? How dare could you have done what you have done? I know we were hiding and we were fearful, but we didn't do what you did, Peter. You and I need to personalize the resurrection that we remember. Because he rose from the grave as part of God's wonderful plan for you and for me. We're resurrected, infected people. We're men and women who know what Jesus went through, who know that through the power of God, he was raised from the dead. But it is so amazing when you and I decide, because we know that we want to walk with him every day. But that's always your choice. But we're ready to assist you if this morning is that day. If it is, would you come while we as a church stand and sing this song?